The annual African Leaders State of Africa report offers much needed commentary on the politics and politics from the perspective of the individuals shaping those trends. The report focuses on perspectives of leaders of the continent who are furthering democratic governance and free market reform. Now, joining us to discuss the latest State of Africa report is Ambassador Charles Stith. He is the director of the African Presidential Center at Boston University. Thank you so much, Professor, and thanks, Ambassador, for joining us. Of course, this is your 11th report. Before we went on air, we were chatting. When you started off, you had quite a small number of African presidents participating, a much larger number, well over 30 now participating in the report. Take us through, how far you've come and what the indicators are in terms of good governance and, of course, much needed economic reform on the continent.
Well, I think the question is a great segue to connect my comments to that of John Meyer from the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation. Yeah. When you talk about young people being hopeful, you have to take into account this is a digital generation. They are maybe not as informed about what's happening in Tanzania as they are in South Africa, but they're very informed about what's happening in Tanzania and what's happening in Nigeria and what's happening in Mauritius and what's happening in Ghana. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the macro trends, they are cause for hope. As you mentioned, when we started doing our work 11 years ago, there were only 11 democratically retired African heads of state and government. Today there are 34. The continent is clearly trending toward democracy. We've seen transitions take place in Ghana, peaceful transitions take place in Ghana with the recent election of John Mahama, the sixth cycle of democratic elections in Ghana. Joyce Banda is now the second African woman head of state. The trends point to progress in terms of governance. When you talk about the economy,
I was just going to come in there, Ambassador. Take us through the kind of linkages between the dividend of a democratic, reformation on the continent and economic progress.
Well, there is a strong correlation between democracy and development. Nigeria is number one on the list in terms of the attraction of foreign direct investment. Almost 20% of the FDI coming to the continent flows in to Nigeria. Nigeria, 7% growth rates. Zambia, 7% growth rates. If Obama had 7% growth rates in the States, even the Tea Party would erect a statue in his honor.
We are talking about these economies coming off a low base, but of course I accept the point that much progress has been made. What I wanted to get into, though, is the connection between the generations of leaders, you focusing specifically on ex-presidents and leadership right at the executive level. But Africa is a youthful continent. The kind of stats that came out of the barometer we spoke about earlier is in fact consistent with what is going on in demographic terms on the rest of the continent. It's a youthful population. How useful is it to use that generation of leadership that your report targets to connect with young people that sometimes feel that there's a disconnect between them and the older generation on the continent?
Well, the leaders featured in our report are folks who are currently in office today.
So these are people who have to deal with their young people.
These are folks who have to deal with their young people, and and they understand. They get the importance of dealing with that constituency. They understand that constituency is literally and figuratively the future. Yeah. Her Excellency Joyce Banda, for example, who recently ascended to the presidency in Malawi, and I'll be visiting with her next week. One of her first initiatives was a presidential initiative to target young people and poverty reduction. So the leadership on the continent gets the challenge. Now, having said that, obviously, dealing with those challenges, it's easier said than done.
Especially in a global economy that's still in a funk in many ways, both in the developed world and also, in the emerging world. Places like China, Brazil is also not seeing the kind of traction that one would have hoped. Take us through the kind of impact of what is possible in terms of, both economic and political progress, given the fact that money is tight and that most of these initiatives obviously do need funds and need assistance. For example, do we see greater participation of the private sector with governments, with democratic, institutions trying to forge a more inclusive understanding of growth, for example?
Well, you do. But I would also say that one of the important lessons to be drawn, or one of the important inferences to be drawn from these positive growth trends, is that there's a lot of opportunity to grow African economies by engaging other African countries.
So inter-Africa trade?
Inter-Africa trade is a huge opportunity. We track 16 countries on the continent. The aggregate population of those 16 countries is 650 million people. That's a serious market.
Oh, absolutely.
And those 16 countries have similar legal regiments and regimes. So if you do business in one place, the rules are going to be pretty similar to those that you're used to. So the opportunity to get more growth by looking internal is there, and hopefully those trends and that opportunity will be one that current leadership gives high priority.
Now, of course, much is made of the kind of competition, if you like, between the two giants on the continent, South Africa and Nigeria. Nigeria with the kinds of growth rates you're talking about. South Africa, of course, very solid, diversified, economy, very good infrastructure, banking systems, legal regimes, and so on. To what extent is the kind of healthy competition between African countries assisting an understanding that the continent needs to solidify as a bloc and increase cooperation?
Well, competition is good. I mean, the answer to the question is inherent in the question. I mean, competition is good. Looking for those things that make you competitive, not only within the continent, but within the global economy, is a good thing.
Yeah.
The other point, though, is that both economies, Nigeria and South Africa, have the potential to anchor growth. And that's as important as the competitive aspect. They have the opportunity to anchor growth. And quite frankly, we've seen a lot of that. A lot of growth that you've seen in SADC since 1994 has been driven by South African capital and South African
capacity. And an integrated
capacity.
approach, I suppose, to economic development.
Yes.
I mean, we've been singing the praises now of the continent, but of course, it would be remiss of me to not focus on impediments and challenges. We still see huge amounts of inequality. We've seen a rollback of some of the democratic gains in places like Mali. We've seen tensions in the Congo, coming forth again with the potential to destabilize the Great Lakes region. And of course, spelling greater risk both for investors, but also for trade amongst African countries. From where you're sitting, to what extent are the kind of deficits in terms of democracy, in terms of stability, still, a big factor, and how much is it holding the continent back?
Well, I think Mali is a different case than the Democratic Republic of the Congo or some of these places that are habitually unstable. But there's a profound lesson in what we saw occur in Mali. There was a coup 1 month before the election, and then the country was completely destabilized by Tuareg mercenaries who fled Libya. The lesson here is that Africans need to take greater control, responsibility, and assume a greater degree of accountability for what happens on this continent.